Hello everyone, welcome to the Voice of Nursing. My name's Adrian Tracy, I'm the CEO of ICG Medical. Today we're joined by a very special guest, Dame Donna Kinnair, the Director of Nursing for the RCN. Welcome Donna.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I'm sure we've got a lot of people very interested in listening to you today on the podcast and the blog. Probably be great just to introduce yourself, a little bit about what you've done, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so I'm Donna, and I've been a nurse now for about 35 years. I've done a variety of nursing. I didn't start my life as a nurse. I actually started my life as a training manager for Marks and Spencer's. I had wanted to do nursing as a child, but when I was about 14, my older brother died, and I was a bit struck by that. Not that we hadn't had a pleasant experience or through his death or supported, but I just was a bit wary of facing bereaved people, and I thought in nursing you'd have to do a lot of that. So I went off to university and did maths instead, so rather than become a nurse. And it was after I'd done that, I was working as a training manager in Marks's, and I met a nurse. I was pregnant at the time, and I'd gone to see a nurse who, I said to her, you know, I always wanted to do nursing, and she looked me straight in the eye and she said, you still can, what's the problem? And it was then that I decided, well, I might just give it a go, because while I enjoyed retail, I had sort of wanted to be a nurse, and the ability to learn again, go back to training, also to work with people, and also to have sort of a specialist knowledge was quite attractive to me. And as I was having a child, I also thought it'd be good because I'd be able to work different hours, sometimes on social hours, so I'd always be able to work, and I wanted to always work. So that was my start into nursing, was just by meeting another nurse by chance, and her directing me to become a nurse, really, and sort of just giving me that self-belief that I could switch careers. So that was how I started, and as soon as my son was 6 months old, I started training as a nurse, and it was exactly the right job for me. It had variety, I was learning about new things. You worked with people, and I love working with people, so it was important to be able to communicate, and I just really enjoyed it. So, and also the camaraderie of the people that you train with. So many of my friends, long-time friends, are people today, are people that I started off with. We still have weekends together, and it's been a long time, and we've watched each other get older.
Mature.
Yes. So yeah, and the beauty of being a nurse is that you could work in a variety of fields. So when I trained, we weren't put on the register as adult nurses, you were put on the register as a nurse. And I worked in children's nursing, I did ITU. I started out, and I was doing an interview earlier this week where I was saying that one of the first things that I came across as a nurse was working with people with HIV and AIDS, and it was in the 80s where actually my overriding memory of that time was that it was such a hopeless situation. No one knew where this new condition was coming from. We knew some of the symptoms, everyone was afraid. That is not just patients, but even the staff were afraid because we didn't know what the origin was. We just knew that we were seeing massive amount of people, or particularly white males, who were very terminal with some kind of sarcoma condition or some kind of pneumonia, polycystic pneumonia. And so it was a really frightening time, and I remember as I started nursing, I remember going up into our sort of nurses' room where we'd hang out sometimes when we were off duty. And on the wall was posters of people that had come to nurse in London when we had, pneumonia, or a kind of pneumonia, or not the plague, but later on when we had some mass disease, and most of them died. So you were very aware that, when you didn't know how an infection was passed, you were vulnerable to it. So I think, we struggled through some of those years in terms of how we gave care. And certainly, as a nurse, one of the most important things for people is that touch is so important. It's an important means of communication, just really to share with someone, and you couldn't do that in the early days. You were masked up, you were gowned up, because we didn't know where this condition was coming from. So it was really hard to sort of work with your patients, knowing that they were so terrified, knowing that we had no answer to the condition that they've had. And so for me, one of the most dramatic changes is that if you have got HIV today, it's like any other long-term condition. So I'm not looking at you thinking that this is a hopeless condition where you've, you know,
the advanced technology
with the right drugs, and so that's one of the real sort of things that I often celebrate when I think of walking through that door as a young woman and thinking, it's quite hard nursing when you've got no answers for people. So today, when you're not seeing people with an end stage or end of life, but actually people are treated as in outpatient clinics, and they rock up and nobody else needs to know about their condition. You know, when we were dealing with it, it was full of stigma. People were terrified. We hadn't had the education that nurses would get about that condition now. So I think there's been a huge amount of changes.
So I think back in the day, the lack of knowledge must have been very scary, as you say, especially if you don't know how it could be passed over. You know, is it airborne? Yeah, you wouldn't know.
We had some idea that it might be sexually transmitted, but we didn't know any more than that. We didn't know how. So, and we'd never been educated to look after that. But we were educated to look after patients at the end of their life. But there were so many organs failing for these individuals, and also we had that era of infected blood. So, but then you would see 18-year-olds that were now infected with HIV. So it was a really hard period of nursing. You really had to learn quickly, and so it was just wonderful to see some of the changes that have happened.
And where did you sort of move on after that?
I did HIV and AIDS and surgical nursing first. I then started having a few more children, so I ended up doing anaesthetic nursing. I did children's, gynae. I was obviously one of those people that needed to move fairly quickly. I did some ITU because after a while it was just a challenge for me. I challenged myself really to look after the unconscious patient. So I did a bit of ITU just to make sure that I could do that. Yeah. And the rest of the time was predominantly adult nursing. I then had 3 children, so I needed a job where I could sort of do 9 till 5. So I then went to work in the community and I trained as a health visitor.
Oh, very good.
So I was just where I trained yesterday, actually, with all the community nurses there, and that was in the Borough of Newham, where it was sort of, they showed me a picture of me 25 years ago yesterday. So, and it was really a lovely borough, but huge challenges because there were just so many people. I remember it was the first time, even though I'd come from Hackney, which would have been regarded as a socially deprived borough, that when I actually started working as a health visitor, and bear in mind I trained in Tower Hamlets, so that was equally a socially deprived borough. It was just so interesting to see that you would sometimes walk into a house and you'd have 10 people in one room. And just prior to going to work as a health visitor, I had done some overseas work. So I'd worked in Kenya with HIV and AIDS, and it was just interesting that when I actually looked at children in Kenya, I'd never seen some of the conditions that what we see as really malnourished children. I actually saw that in the Borough of Newham, in our country, as a health visitor. So I was really shocked and amazed, but it was actually a fantastic time because it was working with the community on so many different issues. We had issues with female genital mutilation, we had issues with housing issues were probably one of the biggest factors. And when you're in cramped and damp conditions, as some of our housing stock was, that's where you're brewing diseases and passing them on ever so quickly. And so it was a challenge because a lot of the Bangladeshi community didn't have English as a first language. They had, as the government or the local authority said, well, they'd made themselves intentionally homeless by coming here in the first place. So that's how we treated them. And consequently, we didn't think it was our job to help house, and so they ended up being in ever more deprived conditions. And that was when I think in my nursing I actually became a bit of an activist and started to sort of challenge some of the issues that I was seeing. And that led me, I was so irritated by the Housing Act, it actually led me to go and study law as a nurse. So I sort of took up studying law part-time and just thoroughly enjoyed what I was learning. I never ever did housing law really, did a bit of it, but that wasn't the main reason or the thing that I came out with. I mean, I did then start to understand it, but it actually gave me the words to challenge some of the local authority. So I remember writing a letter to the Director of Social Service or Director of Housing at that time, and was invited in for a meeting and able really to put what I felt. And I remember in the letter I said to him, it's fine for you to talk about ACT, but I'm talking about things that I'm seeing on the ground, people suffering harm and children absolutely malnourished, and you have a responsibility for that. So actually it did sort of start me off on a bit of a activist stint where I actually sort of did a bit of challenge, and then I found myself challenging so many things thereafter. I then moved to work in Tower Hamlets and ended up working as a child protection advisor, early days, sort of just really working with children and young people and nurses that worked with them. So it was really interesting at that time because it was working on the edge of health, but with the social services, and really what was health's responsibility when they saw children that perhaps weren't quite right or that had other social issues, and we hadn't really by that time worked it out.
And so that's what they always talk about now. I know Neil Dixon, who we've had on the podcast, the CEO of the NHS Confederation, he talks about health and social care being together.
Yes.
And Dr. Umesh Prabhu talks about the devolution in Manchester, and he says they've got the first, I think it's the pilot having one budget, which covers all of it to make sure it's more joined up. But you were doing that back in the day.
We were doing that back in the early 90s,
right, okay.
Where we were working with our social services counterpart and making sure that we supported nurses in the identification of children that were vulnerable in our system. And I think, that was a real learning experience for me, because even though I'd lived in inner city London all my life, even though I knew that there was a huge amount of children with lots of different languages and lots of different cultures, I hadn't really experienced so much deprivation and its impact on children's health. So it was just an amazing time where I was learning lots and able to do quite a bit for some children and young people.
And where did you move on to after that?
I stayed in Tower Hamlets for a little while because they just appeared. I'd never really ever intended to be a manager because I'd sort of done my management training in Marks and Spencer's. So I never really intended, but at the time in Tower Hamlets they didn't have a manager, so I stepped in to be the locality manager and just enjoyed working with all of the community services. So I did that temporarily, but at that time my true love was child protection, and I really enjoyed it because it was being able to educate nurses and doctors. It was I was able to use many of my legal skills in supporting people in statement writing. I knew it was a world I knew and understood really well, and was able, I felt, to impart a message to others, or even inspire others to make it important that they actually looked out for our children, the children that we looked after.
And you moved on to, when did you move into the sort of director position?
I actually took a specialist job as a child protection specialist, which was a sort of middle managerial role, and that took me to South London because I'd never even been south of the river. So that was my first. I think
That's what the cab driver.
Yeah, it was really funny because I was like, how do I get to New Cross? New Cross is just down the road from Hackney. It's like not that far, but I'd never been to New Cross. So I took a job in New Cross that was really responsible for setting up child protection systems in both Lewisham and Southwark. So it was working across those boroughs, so all the hospitals in those boroughs, and making sure that we had doctors and nurses that were adequately trained to be able to respond to children in difficulties. And then I did that for, it was probably my favourite job, because it enabled me to travel, teach, learn, look at other cultures, work with nurses and doctors both practically, so I'd go out and do visits with them, but equally I'd be able to do education, teach, go into undergraduate training for both medics and for nurses and support their education. So it was just the most fabulous job. It's probably one of my favourite jobs, really.
Don't tell the RCN that.
It probably was my favourite job, partly because it was so varied and you never knew what child or mother was going to walk through the door or you were going to be working on. So huge amount of investigation skills, lots of court prep, I mean just a whole variety of jobs. So I did that until after a while they say if you begin to recognise child protection everywhere, you need to think about it. Right. So I don't think I ever got to the stage where I recognised child protection everywhere, but it was very sad. It was a very, very sad job, and quite often, given that I was a mother of 3 children, I'd be working on with a child or a family that children were the same age as my children, and it was just got hard. So at that point I thought, right, okay, I need to do something different, and I then started to combine my ability in sales and retail, and went to the local health authority and became a commissioner for children's services. So that was my first ability to negotiate buy-in, contracts, all the stuff that you train as in retail, as well as understanding the clinical services that you're buying and what needs to be designed with others so that they're suitable for patients.
This is Southwark.
Yeah. So that was partly that was Lambeth, Southwark and Lewisham Health Authority. So I became the Children's Commissioner there, and so it was those 3 boroughs that I was working with around children's services. So it was negotiating contracts, making sure that child health services were okay, working with social services, making sure I still had responsibility for child protection. They didn't let me off that lightly, so I still had to use the knowledge base that I
don't sense you'd let that go somehow.
I don't know, I think I was well ready to let it go, because I think I'd done 10 years of it and it was just about enough. But I still sort of had an interest in making sure that the systems were working and that doctors in the hospitals such as Lewisham Hospital, Guy's and St Thomas's and King's actually were equipped with the skills. So did many teaching sessions right across the area, got involved in lots of issues with children, and so had the whole of children's services at that point, and that was also a really interesting job, because there were new conditions arriving. So I remember one of the first things that I saw as I walked into the office was, do you remember we had that Jacobs viral? Oh, yeah. So the first thing that I had to do was find some services for a child that had this condition, and actually we hadn't got that many services, so that she could stay at home and be looked after. So it was often working with individual families as well as making sure that our services were fit for purpose. So that was a really interesting job, and I'd been just enjoying myself, sort of letting go of child protection when I got called to do the Columbia inquiry. So, and that was right back in the middle of child protection, and as everybody knows, one of the most gruelling cases that I'd ever worked on, more so for me because Victoria was the same age as my own daughter. So honestly, every day of that inquiry you lived it as a mother, because it could have been your own child, or no, it couldn't have been my child because she'd have been well protected, but you know, you recognise that any vulnerable child could have suffered those injuries and that harm. So that was really an interesting time, and it took a whole year. So it was a year of my life, I feel, that was dedicated to that. And it was a lonely time as well, because you couldn't really talk to anybody because everybody wanted to know what you were doing. And actually you were working on something that would be reported on in its due course once we'd gathered all that information. So I found myself staying away from my friends because that's what they wanted to talk about. That's what I couldn't talk about. So yeah, it was a bit of a lonely year. So yeah.
And you moved on then to take the chief nurse position?
No, that inquiry was quite interesting for me because I had a number of legal skills, and I was really concerned about nursing as it presented to that inquiry, because I don't think anybody had appreciated that it would be that adversarial. And so I saw things on that inquiry that affected my own profession. And so even though I'd branched out into sort of general management, commissioning and children's services, I was really sort of, again, it's a character of mine, I was incensed about the way nurses were treated, represented, and all sorts of things. I felt that other professions that came before that inquiry had sort of decent legal representation. The nurses were hugely exposed, and there was no one that seemed to bother about them. They were, I think, treated quite appalling by some of others that were, you know, investigating or in that inquiry. And the impact on me was I was furious. I was absolutely furious that the whole profession was so undervalued. You know, even as some of our unions weren't there for nurses, they were there for social workers, they were there for doctors, but there weren't many that were there for nurses. So that then led me to sort of want to get back close to my own profession. And at that point I thought, right, what am I going to do and how am I going to do this? So once I'd come off the inquiry, I went back to my role as a commissioner, and I started to prepare really for a role with nursing, and I didn't know what that looked like. So, and part of what you did after you did the inquiry is you kind of went on the road to tell people about the inquiry, talk to nurses, talk to trusts, spread the learning, all of that, and that was quite. So I was doing my commissioning job, as well as quite a lot of discussion with the nursing community right across the UK. And it was at that point I thought, well, maybe I should just go for a senior role in nursing, because that would then help me to ensure that no nurse would ever go before a court on my watch without being adequately prepared. And I'd be able to work with them around some of the communication skills, because I think that's where nursing suffered before the inquiry. There were people that were so petrified they couldn't even string two sentences together, given that these people work with the most vulnerable people in our society. So that was my next ambition really. I then decided to talk to every sort of director of nursing that I knew in the network, just to see if it was the sort of job that I wanted to do. And I became director of nursing for Southwark. So that was my shift into directorship. And of course in Southwark you're really dealing with community services, so it was district nurses, but also at that time we were the first, us and Havering, to join a local authority with a PCT. So my chief exec was also the director of social services and chief exec of the PCT, so it was an experimental time. And what happened is that we gradually, although we didn't integrate like STPs are doing now, we worked alongside each other so that we could fuse the cultures, and then we started doing things together. So it was a really fantastic job, because first of all I'd just come off the Climby inquiry, so it would fulfil my ambition to make sure nurses were adequately trained, actually knew how to write reports and statements, and actually were supported in some of those difficult child protection cases. But also that I could advocate for nursing, and so there was passion for me about making sure they were properly trained, that we were sort of educating them to be leaders in the system. And I was able to do that as the director of nursing, but equally working with local authority and social services, we could not just make sure that on the health side, but also on the local authority, work with educationalists, work with social services and social workers. So that was the fabulous job. And eventually we got so like-minded that we started to integrate our services. So part of one of the jobs that they gave me, because you'll see that being a commissioner, you're also quite a planner of services. So one of the first jobs was making sure that I integrated children with disability services, which was a challenge because they had 3 goes at it before. And when someone tells you, under the best value review, we want you to have a look at integrating services, you think, oh, how am I going to do this? Because if 3 people had a go at this, what are we going to do? And it struck me, because I'd been a health visitor, because I'd worked with the community and I understood community development, to actually work with the community and put them at the centre. And so I just found from all the health visitors, all the parents with children with disabilities, and actually said to them, if we were going to plan a service for you, what would it look like? Knowing that we had some confines already, but they were able to say things like, I don't want to go and see a social worker, then the paediatrician, and then, then the educationist or the SEND teacher. And then when you go to each of them individual, one will say, well, it's not my fault, it's the other's fault. So actually what we've tried to do is say, could we plan a service with all 3 of them in the room? So actually they weren't blaming each other. And it was, a mother with a disabled child or 2 didn't have to go to individual services and meet individual doctors, teachers, nurses. How about we do it together and make their life easy? So that was the planning of that service that we sort of delivered and we worked on, and it meant that we had to integrate some of our services. So our doctors had to work with teachers, our doctors had to work with social workers, our nurses had to work with all of them. Nurses usually do work with all of them, but it meant that we could deliver it, and then we put it in a building where it was integrated and called it Sunshine House. So, yeah.
Good. And was it from there you moved on to the chief nursing role?
Yeah, I was in Southwark. I did lots of roles in Southwark because obviously you can imagine I'm kind of...
Definite thirst for knowledge we're picking up and a bit of passion.
Or just for doing different things. So I became Director of Nursing and Children's Commissioner in Southwark, and then I became Director of Nursing and Adult Commissioner, and then I became the Commissioner for both health and social care. So I did the commissioning of, it went from the NHS contracts at Guy's and St Thomas's and King's to Meals on Wheels. So it was the whole of commissioning sat under one person. So we had to integrate teams around drug addiction, mental health. We had integrated teams right across the piece. And it was, I think, the first integrated services that we ever did have in the country, and we worked amazingly well. We actually had a one-stop shop where, it didn't have to be a nurse that went in to see it. We gave our social workers some extra skills, we gave our nurse some social work skills, so that if you were going into an elderly person, you'd know enough to be able to sort them out, and then if they needed more specialist intervention, you then would refer someone else to go in. But it then meant that we had much more capacity, because you were able to do that little bit much more as an individual in terms of delivering care to your patient. So that I believe Manchester wasn't the first.
Okay.
Unfortunately, by 2012, with the Langsley reforms, they just took the money out, and that just fell apart. So at that time, I became Chief Nurse of South East London, which was 6 boroughs. And it was an interesting job because it was a bit of commissioning, but it was also a bit of making sure that people were delivering, so performance management.
I suppose a big thing for the people watching this, they'd be quite interested to understand, what does a chief nurse do? Because aspirationally, a lot of people want to get to that point in their career.
So a chief nurse is different depending on what area of the sector that you work in. So a chief nurse in a commissioning organisation, which I was, actually you become responsible for some of the performance indicators, that particularly around the quality of care. So a lot of what you'd be doing is either planning innovation in services, or working with trusts or community services or whoever to make sure that the care that's delivered to your population is right. So you might have, I don't know, as a chief nurse, you'd know that X amount of your population, it has back issues, and you'd be looking, so what's the service that we are going to deliver for that part of our population? You'd know how much drug addiction you had or estimates of it, and then you'd be developing services for that. So you'd work with everybody, whether it was the acute trust, the local authority, in order to make sure population health needs were met. And so that was the chief nurse in the community. In a hospital, it would be very different. It would be about making sure you have the right numbers of staff to deliver care. It would be making sure that you innovate the quality of care, that everybody's kept up to date, your education and training. So slightly different, and that's the beauty of nursing, is that actually it can take you almost anywhere.
There's different routes, I suppose. I wouldn't have been aware there was a different commissioning route or an acute route. You know.
There's lots and lots of different routes.
Then we've taken up to present day. Director of Nursing at the RCN.
Yeah.
Another small job for you.
Just before that, I decided, after the Langsley reform, I was a bit heartbroken, and I thought, well, the beauty of nursing is you can go anywhere. So at that point, I went back into a hospital trust and decided to run A&Es as a clinical director, and it was one of the worst performing hospital trusts in the country, and I guess it was my ultimate challenge to myself is, could I bring this trust performance up to a level that made it, not be the outlier in the system. So that took me 3 years and a few ulcers and lots of nights of walking into A&E. So I was responsible for that, and for 3 years it was nose to the grind. When I actually got there, we had 60% vacancy in doctors, and it was something like 60 to 70% vacancy in nursing. So you can imagine, while temporary nursing's good, if your whole workforce is temporary, the continuity of care, or how you actually deliver good care, is challenging. So, there were huge amounts of work to do there, and a lot of that was working with nurses, doctors, everybody in the department. And probably my biggest job there was giving people that belief that we could actually do it, because morale had been consistently low for such a long time that people had forgotten that they could deliver good care. And it took me 6 months before I recognised, how was I going to motivate this whole team of people that across 2 hospitals to actually believe that they could do it. And an opportunity came along, because we had a child that walked in and was just said to a nurse and a doctor, I don't want to die, and then collapsed. And the nurse and the doctor worked on that child longer than you would any other child. And the child, actually, we got the child back, which was just amazing. So for me, it was then an easy parallel, because if you can do that, there's nothing you can't do. So actually it was very easy after that to persuade my colleagues and staff that actually, if we can sort of go to that length, and when everybody else would have given up, actually, even in my experience, the resuscitation would not have gone on that long. And to actually then do that, have that belief that you can do it. So it's something about the belief that they had about how we could raise the standards in the department. And then it became such an easier job, because I then managed to have all the staff with me, and then we started to plan how we were going to make those improvements. And so for 2.5 years it was just nose to the grind. But actually by 2015 we had achieved 96% in the A&E.
That's amazing. But
it was just brilliant. It went from about 47%, and we were starting to regularly achieve 96%. But at that point I thought it would be good for my health to go and do something different. But it was just lovely, fantastic, after 20 years of being out of hospital, going back into hospital and running services. So it just goes to show, actually, the skills are transferable, and actually once you've been educated and taught well, those skills can take you anywhere.
I think the leadership and listening, how you care for your teams. It's almost that nursing background and caring for your teams is, if you care for the team, look after the team will deliver. Absolutely.
If you and it's one thing that whatever job I've done, I've known, if you actually invest in the team will are able then to invest really well in patient care.
Respect, get respect. It's always the saying, isn't it? So, Director of the RCN, What does that entail?
Well, it's a really interesting, because I actually didn't apply to become a director at the RCN. I was thinking that I'm sort of going to start to, I always said to everybody that I started as a nurse and I'm going to end as a bedside nurse. So I actually took this job at the Royal College of Nursing as the Deputy Director of Nursing. But as soon as I got there was another vacancy, and we were able to live with it for about 6 months, and then there came to the time about, really, I'm supposed to be going down the ladder now, because that was my ambition, to be a bedside nurse at the end of my career. But there was just so much to do at the Royal College of Nursing. So I then took the post as Director of Nursing, Practice and Policy. So that means that we've got a membership of about 450,000 nurses that you respond to. And the college was there before the NMC. So we started the Register of Nurses, just over 102 years ago. And that just means that we worked really hard to set the standards, the education requirements, the pay conditions, all of those things that people have now access to in some form or another, and also some of the issues that are affecting the nursing profession. So it's a really unusual job, because it uses a lot of different skills. So your ability to negotiate, having to communicate with many different tribes of nurses, and every single one of those tribes is the best nurse ever. And that's one of the hardest things, is whatever your discussion, there are so many individual points of view about the impact on them as individuals. So there's a lot of coalescing and making sure that you can hold the voice of nursing and make a voice of nursing from many different viewpoints. So that's one of the trickiest things, I think, that you have to do. I think other tricky things as a college that we have to do is really negotiate with both the NMC when they're setting standards, and work with them to make sure that they suit the needs of the profession as it is today, and really provide that nursing advice to them, because actually that's where most of the nursing advice is located. Equally, having those discussions with government and health secretaries who want to just do away with some of the good things that one might consider in nursing, particularly at a time when we have so many vacancies in nursing. So with 40,000 vacancies, then we take away the bursary. And I guess our job is to argue, or at least put the arguments on the table as to why that's not a good idea. And sometimes they're listened to, and sometimes they aren't. And then we have the consequences of when they're not listened to.
I know something you're passionate, you've been talking about around safe staffing levels on wards, and it's one of the biggest challenges our nurses face.
So for the Royal College of Nursing, workforce is one of the biggest issues, because at the moment we know there's a gap of 40,000, and I suppose the college's view is that doesn't mean we should not have the right standards, because we know if you haven't got the right workforce, you can't deliver safe patient care. And that is the biggest issue, because we often spend so much time talking about patient safety, but if you haven't got the workforce, how can you make it safe? And what for me is a particular perspective that college is trying to get to grips with is that's fine, because it feels as though from the government's perspective that's fine, we don't have enough nurses, we'll take away the bursary, we'll leave nursing without, we'll cut their professional development education by 70%, and then you want safe care to be delivered. So if you haven't educated the workforce, or you can't educate the workforce, you don't pay them enough for them to pay for their own education, because education is expensive. You're not you're not encouraging people into nursing because no one wants to take the huge amount of debt to become a nurse. Then we have got a lot of problems to solve. And the college's job is predominantly working with government to find solutions to that. So we will work with them as they introduce the nursing associate, which for them might be a cheaper way of delivering a workforce. But we know that if you haven't got the skills, the more skills you have, the better the better care you will deliver. So it isn't about dampening down the skills. For us, it's about making sure that every nurse has the skill to deliver care across a complex range of conditions, services.
And it might be good, we asked this to Emma yesterday, just trying to explain the difference to what the nursing associate as a new role is compared to maybe like a healthcare assistant. It'd be good to kind of understand that, because it's, where does it sit? Is that something that healthcare assistants can be encouraged to go into, or just, for a layman's perspective?
So the Royal College of Nursing was really pleased when we developed the role of nursing associates.
They've got nursing apprentices as well, haven't they? Yeah. I think they're talking about that.
Yeah, so the nursing associate was, the government wanted to bring in a new role at a band 4 level. So it was somebody that had education and training, and a formal education and training, so a curriculum has been developed. We know what outcomes they can deliver. So almost it's a nursing associate with education, which we had and regulation, which we have always asked for, because actually, if patient safety is one of the most important things, it's important that we have people delivering care educated and regulated. So it is something that they're labelling it a new career, partly because, for them it might feel a bit easier in terms of it is nursing, so how can it be a new career? But I think it's the politic of the word, so that they're labelling it so that actually someone doesn't come along and say, well, if I'm doing the same as you, a nurse, why don't I be paid the same as you? Why have you stopped mine at a band 4? And that is some of the finer workings of it. And we're yet to see how it plays out, because I think what you'll find is that we will have the outcomes that they're working to, that the NMC are prescribing, are very similar to the outcomes. The code that they're working to is the same code, with some slight changes to that of a nurse. So in reality, it isn't a new profession, but it seems that we're labelling it as a new profession so that we can somehow disassociate it from nursing, which is, it makes the mind boggle as to why we would go to those lengths to do it.
Let's get more nurses. And obviously, you've seen, fantastic career going all the way up through, through the ranks, if you like, to where you are now. How do you sort of see the future of nursing? Well, no, that's quite an open question, but what challenges, opportunities?
So I've always thought nursing is one of those careers that you can come from. It's a very socially mobile career, and actually there's so much you can do in it. So if you were a bit like me, sort of, you can dance around in different areas, and you're always giving something, no matter what area you're working in. You are giving a huge amount to patients and patient care. So I think the future is that it is going to be a vital career, and I think nurses, if you look at the education of a nurse now, they are able to do so much within their scope of practice that you see nurses out there. So we've got nurses at the moment that are running practices, GP practices. They're actually in charge, and they employ a doctor when they need a doctor. So they're doing everything else. We're seeing advanced nurse practitioners being able to deliver end-to-end care, including prescribing.
I've seen first surgical nurse this year, Sarah Delby, I think her name is.
Sarah Delby. Yeah, doing operations. There are so many things that nurses can do. And so I think the future is going to look very different. And I think some of the issues that have happened around not having the bursary, I think nurses will take responsibility for their own education, and they will advance themselves in the fields of practice that they wish to do. And therefore, I just don't think there'll be any stopping them.
It's more like the gig economy, I suppose, in for nursing.
Yeah.
And I know one of the biggest things we always talk about in the Voice of Nursing is also the pressure nurses are under. Mm-hmm. And we talk about the mental health of the state of nurses and looking after that. Is that something that the RCN are looking at, or is there any support around that?
So we're just doing a project actually with the government around the mental health of nurses, and we know that it's one of those professions that have a higher than normal rate of suicide. So it's something we have to take seriously, because actually, throughout my whole profession, one of the things that I've learned is that it's so important to look after yourself, because if you're not well, you can't deliver good care to others. And some of that is just not just physical.
A happy nurse, happy patient.
Yeah, absolutely. And making sure that we as employers look after the health and well-being, because actually, it's been proven across all sectors that if you care for your staff, they'll care for your patient.
Do you see any trends coming over the next year or two that you can identify or that nurses would be interested in, especially from your point of view of seeing quite a number of different areas?
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to see how nurses get engaged in the leadership agenda, particularly in the SDPs. Now, it's been really hard for nurses to get into those conversations because people see them as just doing things, not as working with patients and being able to offer real life solutions. So if you think about nurses compared to any other profession, 60 to 70% of their time is spent with patients. So you're actually delivering the care. You might not be performing the operation, but every bit of care thereafter is delivered by nurses. So actually, they've often got access to the voice of patients, and therefore it'd be really good to see how they work in close to patients, or they co-work with patients in order to make services meet the needs of patients going forward.
I think quite interesting what you say is the care element. Like Dr. Umesh was saying about, he really encouraged doctors to speak with nurses about the care and the care of the patient. And I know Chris Poynton from the Hello My Name Is campaign, he says the care when Kate was receiving was about hello my name is. It's just a simple thing, but the nurses around the care element was the big thing that they gave to the patients.
And actually, the voice of nursing should be fueled by the voice of patients. So there is there's no care of me without me. So I think that nurses really have the ability to tap into that. And I think future trends will mean that as people become more able to participate in their care, much more, because if you think about Dr. Google and the way in which the world has changed and information is available, so actually I think the role of the nurses will change, and that they'll be standing alongside patients who will be the person in charge of their care going forward.
So the diagnosis. And is there any advice looking back now that you might have given to your younger self going into the industry?
I think whatever career I would have made it fun, but I just would not have believed that the girl that walked onto the steps of the London Hospital in 1983 will have grown so much and developed so much. So it's been a fantastic career. So my advice to myself I would have said probably do it before you did all the wasting time doing all the other things.
Don't do the retail.
Yes. Although the retail gave me so many skills and that whole view of working with customer, so it made
it's almost like you had the customer service training first and then the care.
It's always interesting because a patient is someone that in some people's mind receives care. If you sort of see a patient as a customer, you give them so much more voice into what they're receiving or how they want to receive it. So I've been really fortunate because every single bit of training that I've done throughout my life has made me who I am, but I've also been able to use it all. So even sort of the buy-in as a buyer in Marx's, who thought I'd be buying health services for a population? So and actually those skills from a younger age really stood me in good stead. Now I guess if I was not had that exposure, it would have been so much harder, because I don't think that other commissioners that I met had that training. They just fell into it accidentally, and therefore they'd never sort of gone through the business side of it, or unless they came as direct entrants from business. But clinicians had not had that experience. So when you think about the 2012 reforms where we suddenly made GPs commissioners, well, what experiences they had? They've been delivering clinical care for most of their life. And yes, there were small businesses, but it was more about their income. And then suddenly we're asking them to translate that to look after the health of the population. And they had, so where will they go? How were we going to give them those skills? It's trial and error, and it's continued to be so. And it won't fix a health system.
No, GPs would have to be for another day. Just maybe a person. What do you do outside of work? You seem to be working all the time, and lots of passion about what you're doing.
And what do I do outside of work? So I'm a cyclist usually, so I do quite a lot of cycling, and I cycle.
Road racing or?
No, not that. I'm too old for road racing now. But I used to do sort of really long cycle rides. So love to do London to Brighton, Prudential rides, those sorts of things. I do a lot of reading. But these days, I sort of read so much for work. I find that I have to go on holiday to sort of stack the books up that I'm really interested in.
Any books you can recommend?
I think the latest one, if you really want to know about nursing, is The Language of Kindness by Chrissy Watts, and that actually is one of the best documentations of the role of a nurse that I've seen, and how sort of you can accidentally fall into things, but how much knowledge underpins the work that we do. So I think if anybody wants to just understand nursing, read that book.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And just to finish, was there anything you'd like to say to the nurses? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, I think it's been a fantastic career for me, and one of the reasons why I came into nursing is because I knew that sometimes I might need to work temporarily in nursing, and that's one of the beauties of it. As long as we can hold on to the care, the compassion, the empathy, the knowledge and the skills, you can go anywhere in nursing.
Superb. Donna, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to all our nurses, our healthcare workers, our doctors for all the care that you give us. Thank you to the Voice of Nursing. We look forward to catching up with you soon.